The year was 1943. In a modest bakery located on Rudel Street in occupied Lyon, France, something far more perilous than simple bread was being prepared each morning before the sun rose. As Nazi officers walked casually past the shop entrance, inhaling the welcoming scent of freshly baked baguettes, they remained completely unaware that the very loaves they were purchasing carried messages that would ultimately lead to their own downfall. The baker's hands, covered in white flour dust, were doing more than simply creating food for a city starving under occupation. They were inscribing death warrants for German patrols, encoded within the golden crust of every loaf. This is the authentic account of how an ordinary individual transformed his bakery into the most efficient communication center of the French resistance, preserving hundreds of lives while standing face to face with the enemy each and every day. By the time you reach the end of this video, you will comprehend why the Gestapo referred to him as the ghost they could never capture, and why his story remained hidden for more than 70 years. Before Nazi jackboots began echoing across the cobblestone streets of Lyon, the city was recognized as France's gastronomic capital, a place where food represented not merely sustenance, but art, culture, and the very essence of identity. Jean-Claude Beaumont was nothing extraordinary within this world of culinary heritage. At 28 years old, he inherited his father's bakery, a humble establishment that had been serving the neighborhood across 3 generations. His working day commenced at 3 inches the morning, lighting the brick oven that his grandfather had constructed with his own 2 hands, mixing dough using the identical recipes handed down through decades of peacetime. The residents of Rudel knew him simply as the reserved baker who consistently offered a kind smile and whose croissants somehow achieved an impossibly light texture. He possessed no military experience, no espionage training, and no indication that he would evolve into anything beyond what he already was. A simple artisan attempting to earn an honest livelihood in a world that still possessed meaning. Then, June of 1940 arrived, and everything that once made sense shattered like fragile glass beneath a heavy blow. The German Wehrmacht advanced into Lyon with overwhelming force that transformed summer into winter in an instant. The occupation wasn't merely a military conquest, but rather a suffocation of the human spirit. Curfews were established, radios were seized, and anyone discovered listening to BBC broadcasts faced immediate death. The Gestapo set up their headquarters less than 3 blocks away from Jean-Claude's bakery, commandeering a hotel that became a house of tortured screams. Every morning, he observed his neighbors averting their eyes as German soldiers conducted their patrols, rifles slung carelessly across shoulders, as though they possessed not only the city, but the very oxygen its people breathed. Food transformed into an instrument of control. Ration cards dictated who would eat and who would go hungry, and the Nazi administration ensured that collaboration brought rewards of extra butter, additional flour, and extended survival. Jean-Claude could have selected the path of least resistance, and no one would have condemned him for it. The Germans appreciated French bread, and they required bakers capable of keeping their soldiers well fed and their officers satisfied. He received propositions, whispered offers that arrived with guarantees of safety, unlimited resources, and a future where his business would not simply survive, but flourish under the new regime. Several of his fellow bakers accepted these terms, reasoning that feeding the occupying force was preferable to shuttering their businesses and watching their families perish from starvation. However, Jean-Claude had witnessed the Gestapo dragging his neighbor, a schoolteacher named Monsieur Arnaud, from his residence at midnight for the offense of possessing a prohibited book. He had seen the terror reflected in the eyes of Jewish families as new regulations appeared weekly, steadily tightening the noose. And he had heard the rumors circulated in the city's darkest corners about trains departing Lyon, filled with people who never came back. It was during October of 1942 that the resistance discovered him, or perhaps it was he who found them. The initial approach was executed so delicately that Jean-Claude nearly overlooked it completely. An unfamiliar woman entered his establishment just before closing and requested a particular combination of bread that no previous customer had ever ordered. 3 baguettes alongside 2 small round loaves, arranged in what appeared to be a random pattern but decidedly was not. She paid using exact currency, departed without speaking further, and when Jean-Claude cleaned his counter that evening, he discovered a tiny paper slip concealed beneath the coin tray. The message, written in tight handwriting, presented him with a decision that would shape the remainder of his existence. The resistance required someone who traveled freely throughout the city, someone the Germans found trustworthy, someone whose daily patterns were so unremarkable they became essentially invisible. They needed a baker. What the note refrained from stating, but what Jean-Claude comprehended with perfect clarity, was that accepting this assignment meant accepting his own execution order. If discovered, there would be no legal proceedings, no compassion, no swift conclusion. The Gestapo had perfected the craft of making public examples, and traitors received specialized treatment in the underground cells, where screams were intentionally made audible. Jean-Claude sat alone in his empty bakery that night, enveloped by the aroma of yeast and the residual warmth from ovens that had belonged to his family across generations, and reached a decision that would transform him from a simple craftsman into a weapon the Nazis would never perceive approaching. The following morning, he positioned a single loaf in his window, angled in a manner that communicated his response. The war had officially arrived at Rudel, and the Germans remained oblivious that they were already beginning to lose. The system they constructed was so ingeniously straightforward that its sheer ordinariness became its most powerful shield. Jean-Claude would continue his baking routine exactly as he had always done, maintaining his schedule down to the precise minute, ensuring nothing seemed different to the German patrols who passed his establishment every morning at 7:15. Yet hidden within that familiar routine existed a language comprehensible only to the resistance, a code expressed not in written words but through the arrangement, quantity, and varieties of bread showcased in his window. A baguette positioned horizontally signaled a planned Gestapo raid scheduled for that evening. 2 round loaves stacked atop one another indicated an upcoming checkpoint on a particular street. Croissants grouped in sets of 3 communicated that moving supplies through the district was currently safe. German soldiers walked past these encoded warnings countless times daily, occasionally stopping to purchase the very loaves containing alerts about their own military actions, never once suspecting that the courteous baker serving them with a pleasant smile was the individual engineering their operational failures. The intelligence Jean-Claude supplied didn't originate from spectacular espionage acts or dangerous infiltration missions. It emerged from something far more valuable and considerably more hazardous: his complete invisibility as a potential threat. German officers cherished his bakery because it evoked memories of home, of the civilization they professed to be safeguarding, and they conversed freely within its confines. They discussed forthcoming operations while awaiting their orders, grumbled about patrol assignments while consuming pain au chocolat, and exchanged gossip regarding which neighborhoods were being designated for searches. While Jean-Claude wrapped their purchases in paper, he never posed questions, never displayed curiosity, never provided any indication that he understood German beyond the fundamental phrases required for conducting business. His expression remained pleasantly neutral, his actions efficient and unremarkable, and the officers perceived in him precisely what they wished to see: a conquered Frenchman who understood his position in the new hierarchy. What escaped their notice was that his eyes remained constantly observant, his ears perpetually attentive, and his mind cataloguing every careless statement that escaped their lips. However, gathering intelligence constituted only half the operation, and arguably the simpler half at that. The genuine brilliance and the authentic danger resided in how Jean-Claude transmitted his discoveries to the resistance without ever being witnessed making contact with them. Conventional communication methods meant certain death in occupied Lyon. The Gestapo maintained informants throughout the city. Neighbors reported on neighbors in exchange for additional rations, and anyone caught transferring messages faced torture, followed by execution. Dead drops could be monitored, meeting locations could be raided, and radio transmissions could be intercepted and traced. The resistance required a methodology that was entirely public, completely open, yet simultaneously invisible. They needed messages delivered by individuals who possessed no awareness they were functioning as couriers, transported through checkpoints by hands, bearing no conscious guilt. They discovered their solution in civilization's most ancient transaction, the simple purchase of bread. The code operated through a secondary mechanism that transformed innocent customers into unwitting messengers. Certain trusted families within the neighborhood, carefully vetted members of the resistance organization, knew to monitor for specific signals within Jean-Claude's window arrangement. Upon observing the designated pattern, they would enter the establishment and request their bread using predetermined phrases that sounded entirely natural. Jean-Claude would then provide them with a particular loaf, consistently warm from the oven, always wrapped in the identical brown paper every customer received. But prior to wrapping certain loaves, Jean-Claude would employ a slender wooden skewer to create tiny perforations in the crust, holes so minuscule they resembled natural imperfections from the baking process. These holes, arranged in specific configurations, spelled out numbers using a modified braille system the resistance had adapted for precisely this purpose. The numbers communicated times, locations, and the character of the threat. A resistance operative would obtain the bread from the unknowing customer, break it open at a secure location, and interpret the message literally baked into its structure. The elegance of this system lay in its redundancy and its deniability. If a customer encountered a checkpoint and their bread underwent inspection, German soldiers would discover exactly what they anticipated: a fresh baguette or round loaf, still radiating warmth, completely ordinary. The tiny perforations signified nothing to anyone lacking knowledge of the code, even if the Germans harbored suspicions, demonstrating that random imperfections in bread crust actually constituted coded messages would have proven impossible. Jean-Claude himself maintained absolute deniability because he never directly transferred messages to resistance members. Under interrogation, he was merely a baker selling bread to customers, and the customers themselves remained unaware they were transporting intelligence. The system had been engineered to survive even if Jean-Claude faced arrest and torture, because he could truthfully claim he never encountered the resistance, never provided them documents, never performed any action except baking bread and selling it to whoever entered his establishment. Yet, despite these safeguards, the danger intensified with each passing week as the Gestapo grew progressively more frustrated by the resistance's seemingly supernatural ability to evade their raids. By early 1943, the Germans recognized a leak existed somewhere within their Lyon operations, someone providing the enemy with information of impossible precision. Checkpoints that should have apprehended resistance fighters encountered only bewildered civilians. Raids on suspected hideouts discovered vacant rooms still retaining warmth from recently departed occupants. Ambushes, planned in secrecy, were countered with devastating attacks that decimated German patrols. The Gestapo commenced hunting their ghost with systematic intensity, reinforcing security, limiting information access, and observing everyone with mounting suspicion. And every morning, Jean-Claude ignited his ovens at 3 a.m., mixed his dough with hands that refused to tremble, and waited to discover whether this would be the day his invisible warfare finally became visible. The message baked into bread that particular March morning contained a warning about the most extensive coordinated raid the Gestapo had ever organized. A comprehensive sweep engineered to capture the entire Lyon resistance network in a single operation. Jean-Claude possessed no way of knowing that the officer who had disclosed this information while purchasing croissant had been testing him, scrutinizing his expression for any trace of recognition, any hint of comprehension. The trap was no longer solely for the resistance. It was simultaneously closing around the baker on Rudel. The test arrived on a frigid morning when frost obscured the bakery windows, and the city still slept beneath the burden of curfew. A Gestapo officer named Klaus Zimmermann entered the establishment alone, 30 minutes before Jean-Claude typically opened to customers, his boots striking the tile floor with calculated menace. Zimmermann wasn't among the regular patrons who arrived for breakfast pastries and casual conversation. He was a counterintelligence specialist, transferred from Berlin specifically to locate the source of leaks that were draining the occupation forces. His reputation preceded him through whispered cautions within the resistance network, a man who extracted confessions from suspects who insisted they possessed nothing to confess, who identified patterns where others perceived only disorder. He stood in the entrance studying Jean-Claude with eyes that overlooked nothing, absorbing the flour-dusted apron, the weathered hands, the practiced motions of someone who had executed the identical routine for years. The silence stretching between them felt like wire pulled dangerously taut. Jean-Claude continued kneading dough with steady rhythm, his heartbeat thundering within his chest, while his expression remained calm as undisturbed water. Zimmermann initiated questioning that appeared random, but was meticulously calculated, weaving a web designed to capture inconsistencies and ensnare a man within his own statements. He inquired about Jean-Claude's customers, which German officers frequented the establishment, what topics they discussed while awaiting their orders. He questioned the baker's political views before the war, his perspectives on the occupation, whether he maintained friends or family who had vanished into the darkness. Each question was delivered in fluent French, with a subtle accent that somehow intensified the interrogation's threatening nature, as though language itself had become a weapon wielded with precision. Jean-Claude responded with the weary resignation of someone who had endured 3 years of occupation by maintaining a low profile and keeping silent. He identified the officers who visited regularly because refusal would have appeared suspicious. He acknowledged overhearing their conversations, but claimed he paid no attention because their affairs weren't his concern. He was simply a baker attempting to feed his city and remain alive. Nothing more complicated than that. Nothing more dangerous than flour and yeast. The Gestapo officer moved through the bakery like a predator seeking scent, examining the bread displays with an intensity that transformed innocent loaves into potential evidence. He lifted baguettes and studied their crusts beneath lamplight, running his fingers across surfaces as though reading Braille, which sent ice coursing through Jean-Claude's veins, because that was precisely what the man was doing, even without knowing it. Zimmermann questioned why certain loaves possessed small imperfections, tiny holes and irregularities visible upon close examination. Jean-Claude explained with a craftsman's patient tone that bread was a living entity, that air pockets formed naturally during rising, that no two loaves ever achieved identical results because baking represented an art guided by intuition and experience rather than mechanical precision. He offered to demonstrate the entire process for Zimmermann, from mixing dough to retrieving finished loaves from the oven, an invitation carrying hidden brilliance because guilty individuals don't volunteer to reveal their techniques. The officer declined, but continued his inspection. For 20 agonizing minutes, the future balanced on whether this German would perceive pattern or randomness in the perforations dotting the bread crust. What preserved Jean-Claude that morning wasn't his responses or his composed hands, but something he could never have anticipated or controlled. A young German soldier burst into the bakery with urgent intelligence that a resistance cell had been spotted 3 blocks away, armed individuals moving through the railroad district in broad daylight. Zimmermann's attention instantly shifted from the bread toward this immediate crisis, his hunter's instinct drawn toward active prey rather than the passive mystery of a bakery. He departed without further comment, his coat billowing behind him as he rushed toward distant gunfire, sounds erupting somewhere within the morning fog. Jean-Claude stood alone in his establishment, surrounded by evidence of his treason, his hands finally beginning to shake now that immediate danger had passed. He understood with absolute certainty that Zimmermann would return, that the interrogation had been interrupted but not concluded, and that the Gestapo was circling progressively closer to truth with each passing day. The close encounter forced resistance leadership to make a brutal assessment regarding whether Jean-Claude's operation had grown too perilous to continue, whether the intelligence he provided justified the risk of losing him and potentially compromising the entire Lyon network. They transmitted word through customary channels, a coded message baked into bread, and returned to the baker, inquiring directly whether he desired extraction, whether he wanted to vanish into the countryside and allow someone else to assume the terrible risk of standing in plain view of the enemy. Jean-Claude's response arrived the following morning when he opened his establishment at the customary hour and arranged his bread display with patterns indicating he possessed fresh intelligence to transmit. He had chosen to remain, not from bravery, but from understanding something resistance leadership might not have fully appreciated. The Germans trusted him precisely because he appeared so ordinary, so unremarkable, so utterly unthreatening. The moment he disappeared, that trust would convert to suspicion, and Zimmermann would dismantle his bakery, his records, and his customer base, until he discovered the pattern. The sole method of protecting the network was continuing to bake, continuing to smile, and continuing to perform the role of the simple craftsman, desiring nothing beyond surviving the war. The ghost could maintain invisibility only by never ceasing to haunt the identical streets where the enemy walked. The intelligence flowing through Jean-Claude's bakery reached peak intensity during spring 1943, when the resistance transitioned from defensive survival to active sabotage operations, requiring precise coordination and split-second timing. Every successful ambush, every derailed supply train, every assassination of collaborationist officials depended upon knowing where Germans would be positioned and when they would be vulnerable. Jean-Claude's position provided the resistance, something they had never previously possessed, real-time operational intelligence from the enemy's own conversations, delivered with such dependability that commanders could plan complex operations, confident their information remained current and accurate. The bread code evolved to accommodate increasingly sophisticated messages, expanding beyond simple warnings to encompass details regarding troop movements, supply schedules, and weapons cache locations. Jean-Claude developed the capability to encode complete operational briefings into his morning display arrangement, a language written in carbohydrates that could be interpreted by trained eyes within seconds, then consumed as evidence, vanished into hungry stomachs. However, the operation's success generated its own escalating peril, because the Gestapo wasn't blind to the pattern of their failures. Zimmermann had become obsessed with identifying the source. The counterintelligence officer began mapping every successful resistance action against a timeline, searching for the common thread, connecting events that appeared random but were clearly coordinated. He established surveillance on known resistance sympathizers, monitored correspondence, tapped functioning telephone lines, and pressured informants to report even the smallest irregularities in their neighbors' behavior. The net was constricting in ways Jean-Claude could sense but couldn't observe, a noose woven from suspicion and methodical German efficiency. Twice more, Zimmermann materialized in the bakery without warning, posing variations of identical questions, observing Jean-Claude's reactions with the intensity of a scientist examining bacteria under a microscope. The officer never formally accused, never arrested, but his presence conveyed the implicit threat that one mistake, one inconsistent response, one moment of visible fear would suffice to justify transporting the baker to Gestapo headquarters, where truth was extracted using electricity and blades. Resistance networks across Lyon operated in cells deliberately isolated from one another, a security measure ensuring that if one group faced capture and broke under torture, they could only betray the handful of individuals they actually knew. Jean-Claude existed in a unique and uniquely dangerous position because his intelligence benefited multiple cells simultaneously, meaning his value to the movement was immeasurable. but his knowledge of the larger network was deliberately kept minimal. He knew only 3 contact points, 3 faces belonging to individuals who would collect the encoded bread and distribute intelligence to appropriate commanders. He didn't know their actual names, their addresses, or what operations they were planning. This ignorance functioned as his armor, because even if the Gestapo captured him and applied every technique in their arsenal of horror, he couldn't betray what he didn't know. The system protected the network, but offered no protection to Jean-Claude himself, who understood that if Zimmerman decided to arrest him based purely on suspicion, there would be no rescue operation and no prisoner exchange. He would simply disappear into the basement cells and eventually into an unmarked grave. The psychological burden of maintaining his double existence began manifesting in ways Jean-Claude struggled to conceal but couldn't entirely suppress. He ceased sleeping more than 2 or 3 hours nightly, his mind refusing rest because closing his eyes meant surrendering the vigilance, keeping him alive. His hands developed a tremor, appearing only during solitude, shaking uncontrollably once the performance concluded and the mask could slip. He lost weight despite being surrounded by bread daily, his appetite destroyed by constant cortisol flooding his system. The face reflected in his mirror each morning belonged to someone aging in accelerated time, new lines appearing around his eyes, gray spreading through his hair like advancing frost. Yet when he stepped into his bakery and secured his apron, the transformation was complete and absolute. The frightened individual disappeared, and the pleasant baker emerged, smiling at customers and discussing weather and rations, as though his greatest concern was whether the flour shipment would arrive punctually. What sustained Jean-Claude through the exhaustion and terror wasn't patriotism or ideology, but something more fundamental and more powerful. Every morning when he encoded a message into bread crust, he was preserving lives he would never encounter, protecting families he would never know, providing desperate people opportunities to escape raids that would otherwise consume them. He had learned through whispered reports filtering back through the resistance network that his warnings had prevented the capture of over 200 resistance fighters and their families. That entire cells had survived because they knew precisely when to evacuate their safe houses and exactly which routes to avoid. Children remained alive because their parents had received bread with holes spelling out danger. Young men and women had escaped torture because Jean-Claude had overheard a German officer mention a checkpoint location while purchasing croissants. The invisible baker had become Lyon's resistance, guardian angel, and he carried that responsibility like a cross growing heavier with each passing day. But crosses, as Jean-Claude knew from his Catholic upbringing, were meant to be carried until the very end. And his end was approaching faster than he wanted to acknowledge. Zimmerman was drawing closer, the questions more pointed, the visits more frequent. Sooner or later, the Gestapo officer would transition from suspecting to knowing. The breaking point arrived on a humid June morning when Jean-Claude discovered the Gestapo had begun deploying a new tactic specifically designed to identify and capture intelligence sources. Zimmerman had ordered his subordinates to plant false information, carefully constructed fabrications about raids and operations that would never actually occur, feeding these deceptions to different groups of German personnel to observe which false intelligence surfaced in resistance actions. It was a classic counter-espionage technique, creating unique versions of misinformation so that when the resistance responded to intelligence only specific officers knew, the leak could be traced to its origin. Jean-Claude learned about this strategy from an unlikely ally, a young Wehrmacht soldier named Private Ernst Weber, who had become a regular customer, not because he supported the occupation, but because he despised it. Weber was Austrian, conscripted against his will, sickened by what he witnessed in occupied France, and he had been quietly passing warnings to Jean-Claude for weeks, disguised as casual conversation about how deeply he missed his mother's baking. The warning arrived, wrapped in seemingly innocent small talk, as Weber purchased his customary morning baguette and mentioned that his unit had been briefed about a major operation scheduled for the following Thursday. A coordinated sweep through the textile district where the resistance supposedly maintained weapons caches. He emphasized the details with subtle repetition, ensuring Jean-Claude understood the timing, location, and scale of the planned raid. Then, as he counted his payment, Weber added in a voice barely above a whisper that his commanding officer had seemed unusually pleased about the briefing, smiling in a manner that made the private uncomfortable because it was the smile of someone setting a trap. The message was sufficiently clear that even the most cautious operative would comprehend. This wasn't genuine intelligence, but poisoned bait designed to identify whoever was feeding information to the resistance. If Jean-Claude encoded this false raid into his bread display and the resistance responded by avoiding the textile district or preparing an ambush, Zimmerman would know with certainty that someone with access to that specific briefing was the leak. Jean-Claude faced an impossible choice that would determine whether he lived or died, and whether the entire Lyon network survived or collapsed. If he transmitted the false information, he would expose himself as the source, and the Gestapo would descend upon his bakery within hours, ending not only his operation, but potentially compromising every resistance member who had ever purchased bread from his establishment. If he ignored the intelligence and transmitted nothing, the resistance would lose their early warning system for legitimate threats, and genuine raids Jean-Claude learned about in the future might catch resistance fighters unprepared because they had grown dependent on his warnings. However, a third option existed, one requiring Jean-Claude to violate every security protocol the resistance had established and assume a risk so enormous that merely contemplating it made his hands shake. He could encode a different kind of message, a warning that the intelligence network itself had been compromised, that the Germans were actively hunting for their source, and that all operations should be suspended until the danger passed. The technical challenge was that the bread code had never been designed to communicate meta-information about the intelligence pipeline's security itself. Every pattern Jean-Claude knew how to create related to specific tactical warnings, raid times, checkpoint locations, patrol routes. No established sequence of holes and arrangements meant the system is compromised or trust nothing you receive for the next week. He would need to improvise a message using existing vocabulary in a manner resistance operatives might understand, while remaining cryptic enough that if the Gestapo somehow cracked the code, they wouldn't immediately comprehend what they were reading. Jean-Claude decided to employ the most extreme version of the warning signal, an arrangement the resistance had designated for use only in absolute emergencies, when Lyon itself was about to fall. He positioned every single loaf of bread in his window upside down, an impossibility under normal circumstances because inverted loaves wouldn't display properly and would appear absurd to any customer. The message was visual chaos, a scream of wrongness impossible to miss. The gamble was that resistance operatives would recognize this impossible arrangement as a signal that something catastrophic had occurred, that the normal system couldn't be trusted, and that they should go to ground immediately. What Jean-Claude couldn't control was whether Zimmerman or his subordinates would notice the bizarre display and recognize it as a coded message, rather than dismissing it as the mistake of an exhausted baker experiencing a difficult morning. He maintained the inverted loaves in position for exactly 20 minutes, sufficient time for early morning resistance contacts to observe and photograph the arrangement, then removed them and reset his display to normal before the majority of German customers arrived for breakfast. Those 20 minutes felt like 20 hours as Jean-Claude worked with his back to the window, listening for the sound of boots rushing toward his entrance, waiting for the shout of discovery that would end everything. When the first regular German customer entered at 7:30 and commented only on the wonderful aroma of fresh bread, Jean-Claude allowed himself to believe he might have purchased the resistance a few additional days of safety. But he also knew with grim certainty that Zimmerman would hear about the upside-down loaves from informants who reported everything unusual, and the counterintelligence officer would add this strange behavior to his expanding file on the baker of Rudel. The resistance comprehended Jean-Claude's emergency signal with a clarity that probably saved the entire Lyon network from decapitation. Their response demonstrated the sophisticated coordination his intelligence had made possible. Within hours of the inverted bread display, safe houses were evacuated, weapons caches were relocated, and key operatives disappeared into the countryside, or into the identities of ordinary civilians who had never resisted anything. The network went completely dark, suspending all operations and severing contact between cells in a coordinated silence that left the Gestapo grasping at shadows. When Zimmerman sprung his trap the following Thursday and raided the textile district with overwhelming force, his soldiers found exactly nothing except confused factory workers and empty warehouses. More importantly, the resistance didn't respond to the false intelligence with an ambush or any action whatsoever, meaning Zimmerman's test had failed to identify his leak. The counterintelligence officer was left with a mystery possessing no solution because the source he was hunting had effectively disappeared without actually going anywhere. Jean-Claude maintained his bakery routine with mechanical precision during the 2 weeks of operational silence, continuing to open at the identical hour and serve the same customers while transmitting absolutely nothing through his bread displays. The patterns in his window were now genuinely random, driven only by aesthetic considerations and natural inventory flow rather than coded meanings. German officers still purchased their morning pastries, still conversed carelessly in his presence, and Jean-Claude still listened with the attentiveness that had become second nature. But the intelligence he gathered went nowhere because the collection mechanism had been deliberately shut down to protect both the source and the network. This period of enforced inactivity was psychologically devastating in ways active operation had never been, because Jean-Claude remained acutely aware that people were probably dying due to raids he could have warned them about. That resistance fighters were walking into traps he possessed the information to help them avoid. The weight of that unutilized knowledge crushed him more severely than the fear of discovery ever had. Zimmerman interpreted the sudden disappearance of the resistance's tactical advantage as confirmation his counterintelligence operation was working, that he had frightened the source into silence, even if he hadn't yet identified them. He increased the frequency of his visits to Jean-Claude's bakery, no longer pretending these were casual inspections, but openly treating them as interrogations. The questions became more specific and more dangerous, probing exact details about which officers had been present on which days, what conversations Jean-Claude might have overheard, even accidentally, whether he had noticed any customers paying unusual attention to his bread displays. The Gestapo officer brought photographs of known resistance members and asked if Jean-Claude recognized any faces from his customer base. A test particularly treacherous because Jean-Claude did in fact recognize 3 of the faces as his primary contacts, the individuals who collected the encoded loaves. He studied each photograph with the careful attention of someone genuinely attempting to be helpful, then shook his head and explained that he served hundreds of customers weekly and faces blurred together after years of occupation and exhaustion. The psychological warfare extended beyond interrogation into more subtle forms of intimidation, designed to break Jean-Claude's composure and force a mistake. Zimmerman began sending different German personnel into the bakery at random times, young soldiers who would stand silently observing Jean-Claude work, their presence a constant reminder he was under surveillance. Plainclothes. Gestapo agents posing as French customers would ask leading questions designed to sound like resistance recruiting attempts, testing whether Jean-Claude would respond with interest or report the contact to German authorities. His trash was searched, his supplier deliveries were monitored, and neighbors were questioned about his habits, his visitors, and whether he had ever expressed anti-German sentiments. The net was tightening, not through evidence, but through pressure. Zimmerman was betting that eventually the accumulated stress would crack Jean-Claude's facade and reveal the spy hiding behind the baker's apron. What the Gestapo officer failed to understand was that Jean-Claude had already made peace with his eventual capture and death. had accepted that outcome the moment he placed that first signal loaf in his window, back in October of 1942. The fear that might have broken another individual had been metabolized into a cold clarity about what mattered and what didn't. Survival was no longer the objective, because survival under occupation was simply another form of death, a slow suffocation of everything, making life worth living. What mattered was how many people he could save before the end arrived, how much damage he could inflict on the machinery of occupation, how many small victories he could steal from an enemy that seemed invincible. When the resistance finally sent word that operations would resume and that Jean-Claude's intelligence was needed again despite the increased danger, he didn't hesitate or question the decision. He simply returned to encoding messages in bread crust, placing his life on the line with each arrangement, and waiting to discover whether the next customer through his entrance would be someone seeking breakfast or someone seeking his head. The ghost of Rudel was haunting the occupation again, and this time both he and Zimmerman knew their game of invisible chess was approaching its endgame. The critical intelligence that would define Jean-Claude's legacy and seal his fate arrived on August 14th, 1943, during a conversation he was never supposed to hear. A senior SS officer named Hauptsturmführer Dietrich Kohl entered the bakery shortly after dawn, accompanied by two subordinates, and while Jean-Claude prepared their order, the men discussed operational details with the casual arrogance of conquerors who believed French civilians were too stupid or too broken to understand German. Kohl was explaining the final details of Operation Thunderclap, a coordinated mass arrest planned for August 20th that would target not just known resistance members, but their entire families, their neighbors, and anyone who had ever been reported for suspicious behavior. The scope was breathtaking and horrifying. Over 1,200 people were marked for arrest across Lyon, to be rounded up simultaneously at dawn and transported immediately to camps in Germany. The operation was designed to decapitate the resistance completely by removing not just the fighters, but the entire support network of sympathizers, suppliers, and safe house operators who made resistance possible. Jean-Claude continued slicing bread with hands that wanted to tremble but couldn't afford to betray him, his mind racing through the implications of what he was hearing. This wasn't a tactical raid that could be avoided by evacuating a few safe houses or rerouting an arms shipment. This was an existential threat to everyone in Lyon who had ever whispered a word against the occupation, everyone who had hidden a Jewish family in their attic, everyone who had looked away when resistance fighters moved through the shadows. The 1,200 names on the arrest lists included children, elderly grandparents, and people whose only crime was being related to someone the Gestapo suspected. Kohl emphasized to his subordinates that secrecy was absolute, that not even regular Wehrmacht units would be informed until the night before the operation, and that French police collaborators would only receive their assignments 2 hours before arrests began. The SS was taking no chances that information might leak and allow targets to escape, which meant Jean-Claude was hearing intelligence that perhaps fewer than 50 people in all of occupied France currently possessed. The technical challenge of encoding this information into bread was nearly impossible because the existing code system couldn't handle the complexity and urgency of what needed to be communicated. Jean-Claude could signal that a raid was approaching and provide a general time frame, but he had no way to convey the scale of Operation Thunderclap, or the specific date of August 20th, or the fact that this wasn't a standard operation, but a coordinated purge. He made a decision that violated every security protocol and placed him in immediate, mortal danger. He would break the code system entirely and create a message so obvious that even people unfamiliar with standard patterns would recognize it as a desperate warning. That afternoon, he baked a special batch of large, round loaves and used his skewer to pierce letters directly into the crust, spelling out August 20 inches English, because he knew resistance leaders included escaped British SOE agents who would recognize the language. The message was no longer hidden or deniable. It was screaming from the bread itself to anyone who looked closely enough. The problem was ensuring the right people saw the message before the wrong people did, and Jean-Claude's solution was as brilliant as it was suicidal. He placed the marked loaves in a special display with a handwritten sign advertising a promotion for bulk purchases, knowing that resistance contacts had standing orders to watch for any deviation in his normal sales practices. When his primary contact, a woman named Simone, who posed as a housewife, entered the shop that evening, Jean-Claude did something he had never done before. He spoke directly to her in a way that broke their cover. He told her, loudly enough for other customers to hear, that these special loaves were for large families preparing for the Feast of the Assumption on August 15th, and that they should be purchased and consumed before they went stale. The date reference was deliberate, pointing her attention to the timeline. When he handed her the loaves, he positioned them so the letters faced upward and visible. Simone's eyes widened imperceptibly as she read the message baked into the crust, and Jean-Claude saw the moment she understood the magnitude of what he was telling her. What Jean-Claude couldn't see was that Zimmerman had finally positioned an agent inside the bakery itself, a young woman hired 3 days earlier as Jean-Claude's assistant, supposedly the niece of a loyal French collaborator, but actually a German intelligence operative, fluent in French and trained to recognize coded communications. She had been watching Jean-Claude's every move, cataloging his patterns, and waiting for him to make contact with the resistance. She saw him hand the specially marked loaves to Simone, heard the strange emphasis on dates and consumption, and noticed the way the customer's expression changed when she looked at the bread. The assistant waited until Simone left the shop, then excused herself for a break and walked directly to Gestapo headquarters 3 blocks away. Within 20 minutes, Zimmerman knew that his ghost had finally materialized, that the humble baker had been the source all along, and that evidence of his treason was literally written in bread crust for anyone to read. The hunt that had consumed nearly a year was over, and the trap was about to spring shut on Rudel. Zimmerman made the deliberate choice not to arrest Jean-Claude immediately, a decision revealing the true sophistication of his counterintelligence mind and the depth of danger the baker now faced. The Gestapo officer understood that capturing one source was valuable, but destroying the entire network that source fed was infinitely more important. If he raided the bakery and dragged Jean-Claude away in handcuffs, the resistance would immediately know their intelligence pipeline had been compromised and would scatter like birds before a gunshot. But if Zimmerman allowed the baker to continue operating while under complete surveillance, he could follow the bread to every contact point, identify every resistance member who collected encoded loaves, and map the entire Lyon network before crushing it all at once. The counterintelligence officer positioned his best operatives in buildings surrounding the bakery, established observation posts, providing sightlines to every entrance and exit, and ordered his subordinates to photograph everyone who purchased bread over the next 72 hours. Jean-Claude was now bait in a trap he didn't yet know had been set. The resistance response to Jean-Claude's warning demonstrated exactly why the Gestapo wanted to preserve the intelligence network long enough to destroy it completely. Within 18 hours of Simone receiving the marked loaves, an emergency council convened in a safe house outside Lyon, involving representatives from every major resistance cell operating in the region. The message about August 20th had created panic and urgent action simultaneously, because if the intelligence was accurate, they had less than 6 days to evacuate 1,200 people from a city under total occupation surveillance. The scale of the required operation was unprecedented and probably impossible, but the alternative was accepting mass deportation and death. Resistance leaders made the brutal calculation that Jean-Claude's information had always been accurate, that his warnings had never failed them, and that they had to trust him one final time, even if it meant exposing their entire organizational structure in a desperate evacuation effort. The next 5 days transformed Lyon into a city of ghosts as the resistance executed the largest civilian evacuation in occupied French history, moving people through networks of safe houses, forged documents, and smuggling routes that had been built over 3 years of occupation. Families disappeared from their homes in the middle of the night, children were sent to live with relatives in the countryside under false names, and anyone on suspected Gestapo lists was given new identities and new lives. The operation required coordination between dozens of resistance cells, collaboration with sympathetic clergy who hid people in churches, and the complicity of French railway workers who looked the other way when unauthorized passengers boarded trains heading south. It was a masterpiece of desperate logistics, made possible entirely by the 6-day warning Jean-Claude had provided. And every person involved knew they were gambling everything on the accuracy of intelligence baked into bread crust by a man they had never met. Zimmerman watched this exodus unfold through his surveillance network with growing satisfaction, because every evacuation route revealed itself to his cameras, every safe house was documented, every resistance courier was photographed and identified. He now possessed a complete map of the Lyon underground, names and faces and locations that would normally have taken years of interrogation and torture to extract. The Gestapo officer made detailed notes about the organizational structure he was observing, impressed despite himself by the sophistication of the network and the speed of their response. He calculated that he could allow the evacuation to proceed almost to completion, let the resistance believe they had saved their people, and then strike on August 19th, 1 day before Operation Thunderclap, arresting not just the original targets, but every resistance operative who had exposed themselves during the evacuation effort. It would be a decapitation strike so complete that organized resistance in Lyon would cease to exist. Jean-Claude sensed the surveillance closing around him like a fist, even though he couldn't see the specific watchers or identify the trap's mechanisms. The instinct that had kept him alive for nearly a year screamed warnings that something fundamental had changed, that the game had entered a new and final phase. German customers who entered his bakery now watched him with an intensity that went beyond normal wartime suspicion, their eyes tracking his movements with the focus of people gathering evidence rather than purchasing breakfast. His assistant, the young woman who had appeared so conveniently just days before his most dangerous transmission, asked questions that seemed innocent but probed too deeply into his methods and his customers. Private Weber stopped coming to the bakery entirely, an absence that spoke volumes because the young Austrian had been a daily presence for months. Jean-Claude understood with crystalline clarity that he had been compromised, that Zimmerman knew or strongly suspected his role, and that the only reason he wasn't already in Gestapo custody was because the Germans wanted to catch bigger prey. He was being used as bait, and the people he had tried to save by warning them about August 20th were now walking into a trap baited with his own intelligence. The ghost had finally been seen, and visibility in the world of occupation resistance meant only one thing. Death was no longer a possibility but a certainty, and the only question remaining was how many people would die with him. Jean-Claude made his final decision on the evening of August 18th, sitting alone in his bakery after closing time, surrounded by the tools of his trade and the evidence of his treason. He understood that if he continued operating even one more day, the Gestapo would follow his contacts directly to the resistance members who had orchestrated the evacuation, completing Zimmerman's trap and destroying everything he had sacrificed to protect. But he also understood that if he simply disappeared or committed suicide, the resistance would assume he had been captured and would go to ground, potentially abandoning people who still needed evacuation before the 20th. There was only one option that would save the network while preventing Zimmerman from using him as bait any longer. He needed to destroy his own credibility so completely that the Gestapo would have no choice but to arrest him immediately, ending the surveillance operation before it could bear fruit. Jean-Claude would have to confess, but confess in a way that protected everyone except himself. The baker spent his final free night writing a detailed letter in German addressed directly to Hauptsturmführer Kohl, the SS officer whose careless conversation had revealed Operation Thunderclap. The letter confessed everything, that Jean-Claude had been feeding intelligence to the resistance since October 1942, that he had encoded messages in bread arrangements and crust patterns, that he had overheard German conversations and transmitted warnings that prevented dozens of arrests. But the confession was carefully constructed to contain no specific information about resistance members, meeting locations, or operational methods beyond his own role. He described his contacts only in the vaguest terms, claimed he never knew their real names or where they took the intelligence after leaving his shop, and insisted he had acted alone out of patriotic conviction rather than as part of any organized network. The letter was simultaneously a complete admission of guilt and a masterpiece of misdirection, giving the Gestapo their spy while providing nothing they could use to capture anyone else. Jean-Claude placed the letter in an envelope and walked through the dark streets of Lyon to Gestapo headquarters, carrying with him one final loaf of bread marked with holes that spelled out a message in the resistance code. Baker compromised. Ignore all future intelligence. Network secure. He left the marked loaf on the doorstep of a residence he knew belonged to a resistance courier, a woman who would find it at dawn and understand that Jean-Claude's operation had ended, but that she and her comrades were safe. Then he walked directly to the entrance of Gestapo headquarters and handed his confession letter to the shocked guard at the gate, requesting to speak with Kohl immediately about a matter of intelligence importance. The guard read the first paragraph of the letter, his eyes widening, and within minutes Jean-Claude was surrounded by armed soldiers and being escorted into the building from which very few people ever emerged. Zimmerman arrived at headquarters 20 minutes later, summoned urgently from his apartment. When he read Jean-Claude's confession, his reaction wasn't triumph, but volcanic rage. The counterintelligence officer understood immediately what the baker had done, how the self-confession had destroyed days of careful surveillance and prevented the larger arrests Zimmerman had been positioning to execute. By turning himself in before the trap could close, Jean-Claude had protected his network at the cost of his own life, and there was nothing Zimmerman could do to reverse the sacrifice. The Gestapo could torture the baker for weeks and extract nothing of value because Jean-Claude genuinely didn't know the real identities or locations of the people he had served. The ghost had chosen to become visible on his own terms, and in doing so had ensured he would be the only casualty of his exposure. The interrogation that followed was exactly as brutal as Jean-Claude had anticipated, but he endured it with the quiet dignity of someone who had already won the only victory that mattered. They broke his fingers to prevent him from ever baking again, burned him with cigarettes, beat him until his ribs cracked, and demanded names he didn't have and information he couldn't provide. Through it all, Jean-Claude repeated the same truth. He had acted alone, motivated by hatred of the occupation, and he knew nothing about the broader resistance network beyond the fact that people came to his bakery, and sometimes those people understood the messages he left in bread. On August 20th, Operation Thunderclap proceeded as planned, but instead of capturing 1,200 resistance members and sympathizers, the Gestapo found mostly empty homes and forged documents indicating families had relocated for work or family emergencies. The warning Jean-Claude had baked into bread had saved over 1,000 lives, and the evacuation he had made possible had gutted the target list beyond recognition. Zimmerman stood in an empty apartment that should have housed a resistance cell leader and understood that he had been beaten by a baker who wielded flour and yeast like weapons of war. Jean-Claude Beaumont was executed by firing squad on August 23, 1943, and died without ever revealing a single name beyond his own. The story of Jean-Claude Beaumont remained buried in classified Gestapo files for over 70 years, hidden not because the French government wanted to suppress it, but because almost no one who knew the full truth survived the war to tell it. Zimmermann died during the liberation of Lyon in September 1944, killed by resistance fighters who never knew he had been hunting their guardian angel. The resistance operatives who had received Jean-Claude's encoded bread knew only that a baker had helped them, not the full scale of his sacrifice or the sophistication of his operation. The breadth of his intelligence network only became clear in 1998, when a French historian researching Gestapo counterintelligence operations in Lyon discovered Zimmermann's personal files in a German archive. The files contained Jean-Claude's confession letter, surveillance photographs of his bakery, and Zimmermann's furious after-action report documenting how a simple craftsman had outmaneuvered the entire apparatus of Nazi intelligence and saved over 1,000 lives with nothing more than bread and courage. What makes Jean-Claude's story particularly haunting is how completely ordinary he was before the war forced him to become extraordinary. He possessed no training in espionage, no background in resistance operations, no particular skills beyond the ability to bake excellent bread and pay attention to the world around him. He wasn't a soldier or a spy or a natural-born hero, but simply someone who was offered a choice between comfortable survival and dangerous resistance, and who chose to fight back using the only weapons available to him. His bakery became a weapon because he transformed it into one, encoding rebellion into the most basic human need for food and turning every transaction into an act of defiance against occupation. The genius of his operation lay in its visibility, in the fact that German officers bought the very bread that contained warnings about their own operations, never suspecting that the humble baker they patronized was orchestrating their defeat one loaf at a time. The evacuation Jean-Claude enabled in August 1943 proved decisive for the Lyon resistance network's survival and continued operations through the final year of occupation. The 1,200 people who escaped arrest included key resistance leaders, Allied intelligence operatives, Jewish families, and the infrastructure of support that made organized rebellion possible. Many of these survivors went on to participate in the liberation of Lyon, some joining the Free French forces, others continuing resistance operations that tied down German troops needed elsewhere. The military impact of Jean-Claude's final warning rippled far beyond Lyon itself, contributing to the broader weakening of German control in southern France that made the Allied advance after D-Day significantly easier than it might otherwise have been. A single baker's decision to encode a message in bread crust altered the course of the war in ways that can never be fully quantified, but were undeniably real. Today, a small plaque marks the location where Jean-Claude's bakery once stood on Rue d'El, installed in 2003 after the historian who discovered his story campaigned for recognition. The plaque is modest, easy to miss if you're not looking for it, which somehow seems appropriate for someone whose greatest strength was being overlooked and underestimated. Tourists walk past it every day without noticing, and most residents of modern Lyon have never heard of Jean-Claude Beaumont or the invisible war he fought from behind a counter covered in flour dust. But for those who stop to read the inscription and understand what happened in that ordinary bakery during the darkest years of the 20th century, the message is clear and eternal. Resistance doesn't require superhuman abilities or perfect circumstances. It requires only the willingness to use whatever tools you have, to take whatever risks are necessary, and to accept that the most powerful weapon against tyranny is often the simplest human refusal to cooperate with evil. Jean-Claude Beaumont baked bread, and in doing so, he saved a city. His story was erased from history, not by conspiracy, but by the nature of invisible war, where the greatest heroes are often those whose names are never known and whose sacrifices are never celebrated until long after they're gone.